Good morning, everyone. We're continuing now with our conversations about living intuitively. So let's start with the prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dearest Swamiji, guide us with your living presence. Help us to know that we are always in the beam of your light, that we are moving through this world not alone as it may seem at times, but always guided by God if we will respond. Help us always to be open, to be receptive, to be alert and awake, so that we can tell the difference between delusion and freedom. Om. Peace. Amen. This is being recorded on January 21st of 2021. That's kind of a harmonious little 12121. That's quite a date, actually, now that I think about it. It's the day after the inauguration of the President of the United States, and anybody who knows even a little bit about history or who's been living through this knows it's been a rather tumultuous time. It did really feel like a turning of energy tomorrow, but I'm optimistic in the sense that I think it won't be quite so chaotic as it's been, but we still have a lot of issues in Master's predictions that there will be hard times for the planet have not been changed by one transfer of power in the United States. So the subject that we're talking about, living intuitively and being able to move through this world guided from a higher level, is the actual answer to all of those external events. Because the external events of the world, and I've articulated this before, but I have to keep saying it to myself. So I'm going to say it out loud again, because maybe some of you also need to hear it. The drama, the true drama, is the individual soul gradually moving from delusion to freedom. That drama is seems so small compared to the global drama of, threats of war and countries exploding and people rioting, and then new initiatives coming forward. I mean, just that looks like the real story. So it's very hard for us to just realize, to just flip it. Day to the worldly man is night to the yogi. It's not, of course, that none of that matters, because it matters a great deal, because it's the context in which the true drama takes place. And all of it is the context for us to get to find out, to what extent do I really believe in God? To what extent can I hold to that belief and behave accordingly, no matter how the winds howl around me? Or the opposite is also true, because we think that a sort of peaceful, uninterrupted existence, is the most desirable. But the the ability to just fall asleep and drift, even if we keep our eyes open and keep acting when nothing is challenging us, is if you think about the real drama being the compelling need to awaken from delusion and come into the light, having everything be placid and have there be no challenge is not necessarily good karma. Even it might be more pleasurable and take less energy, but if it just postpones the awakening, is that really good? So here we are, and for one day there's been a shift of energy in the country that I live in, but we'll see. Here's an interesting, and this is just a tiny little, just fun thing. Master talked about one of the things that's going to happen is going to be this union between India and America, that India has specialized in internal wisdom and America has specialized in coping with the material world. Both of those are only half. of the perfect circle that, is divine wholeness, and that eventually India and America will unite. And we can already see there's this huge interplay. Well, a friend of mine in India just sent me a little picture of an article in the newspaper, and it was a list of all the relatively high positions in national government that are now filled by people who were born in India. But I mean, presumably they're American citizens now, but it's been that transfer coming in here, including, of course, the Vice President of the United States now. So when you stand back just a little bit and you watch the progress of things, you see how the divine hand is weaving in it. Now I'm talking in the macrocosm right at the moment, and the theme I'm talking about is the microcosm, but everywhere, the microcosm of our own individual lives, but everywhere that we can see the hand of God, and we can see that a pattern that was not obvious, or a result that was not apparent, a purpose that we might not have been aware of, every time we can look at any flow of energy and events, especially ones that are fraught with anxiety or uncertainty at certain points, or drama, or that might unfold over a longer time span, a period of years, for example. But when we see how, in the end, Divine Mother always had a plan, it's very important to pay attention to those things and to imprint them on your consciousness. Because then, when we ourselves are caught up in some other subsequent story, and we really don't know how it's going to end, and we really become anxious as to whether Divine Mother really has a plan, and whether I really want to be part of that plan, and all of these questions we can ask, we can remember, oh, but it always worked out, either in my own life, in the life of others, or even in the whole historical unfolding. A very good friend of mine was caught up in some anxiety about financial matters, and I just said to her, I said, but it's always worked out for you, hasn't it? And later on, she told me that she actually spent a lot of time really thinking about that, thinking about other crises that she'd been through, and realized it had always worked out. And so what were the chances that this time it might not? And I don't mean by that it always came out the way she wanted it to come out. That those are quite different things. And it would be foolish of me to say that your desires will also be fulfilled. That is a false teaching. In the 70s and the 80s, especially in the 80s and somewhat into the 90s, there was a big sort of, in the Bay Area where I live, Silicon Valley area, a big sort of, I guess the only word I can think of is New Age teaching. And the New Age teaching was basically, you set your mind to it and you can have it. And somehow that had a lot of energy going. Maybe there were a lot of groups in the area at the time. I don't remember exactly. But I realized that I was getting a steady stream of counseling appointments from, or requested by, people who I called refugees from the New Age, is what I began to call them. And they were people who would come to me, and it would be like, I've been following this such and so a method, and it said that if I did this, then I could have prosperity, or if I did this, I could heal myself, or if I did this, I could have the relationship I wanted, but it wasn't working. And their appraisal of it was that they were failures, and it didn't cross their mind that the method was false. And the method was false because of the pronoun I. I want. But the I that wants is so often the limited egoic I that wants. And fortunately, and this is actually the good news, the good news is that Divine Mother is not listening to the little egoic, self-defined I. Now, it's not that she doesn't care about that I, and it's not that she won't accommodate it if it works out, but her concern is for our ultimate welfare. And this is why we say Divine Mother. There was a woman that I knew, unfortunately, I say unfortunate, she made a very unfortunate decision. She really didn't like to hear her children cry. So she would do anything to keep them from crying. And as a result, they grew up crippled. It's the only word I can use for it. She crippled them because she was only thinking that they needed to be happy in the moment. She wasn't paying attention to what her real job was. And Divine Mother is paying attention to her real job. And her real job is to make us free. And like a surgeon who has to cut you open and cause you pain in order to remove whatever the cancerous tumor might be, Divine Mother cuts us open and doesn't flinch any more than a surgeon flinches, because she knows what we think is comfort is actually a morass of delusion, and she knows where we need to go. So this is again where, and we're, because this is all about intuition, and I've talked about that part of it a lot, I just wanted to reiterate it again. What is the real plot of the story? And that it's just so easy to get confused. I think of it like the world events are the backdrop for the scene that's being acted out. And it is the backdrop and it is the costume. But the real drama is the internal drama of freedom. Now, today, what I wanted to talk about a certain aspect of intuition, because we often talk about heart and mind. And I've heard many people say, follow your heart. You have to always follow your heart. I've never heard anyone say, follow your mind. You have to follow your mind. It's just like nobody ever says that. And as a consequence, I feel like the fact that we're dealing with two sides of the same coin sometimes gets lost. Now, in trying to think this through, and because of the temperament I have, which is self-evidently, I like intellect. When I met Swami Kriyananda, as soon as he walked in the room, before he spoke, I felt his consciousness. I was made aware of my relationship to him that obviously is many lifetimes old. And it was just all there, literally, when he walked into the rooms. He hadn't even spoken. I hadn't heard his voice. I didn't know what he was like. And then he spoke. Then he gave this lecture about which I remember nothing. I don't remember anything that he said, except somehow I do believe I understood more deeply that he was a disciple of Paramhansa Yogananda, which in theory I think I had known before, but somehow that became more clear. But actual words, I remember none of them. But I remember when he finished talking, again, I had this very strong intuitive thought, he's the most intelligent man I have ever met. Now, that was a super big deal for me, because I was intellect. I like intelligence. That's the only way I can put it. It's a hobby of mine. It's just like I enjoy it. If Swami had not been that kind of person, by that I mean intelligent articulation of ideas is just something that some people do. It's not like, in and of itself, it's not a sign of spirituality or wisdom or anything. It's just a sign of intelligent articulation of ideas. And it's a hobby of mine. I like it. I'm entertained by it. And when I saw that Swamiji also had that quality, uh, it made me happy, because I would have followed him if he were in Mon. I would have followed him if he never spoke. But it was just like, oh, isn't that fun? We have the same hobby. It's sort of how I felt about it. And I knew that there would be a certain attunement. None of that is a surprise, really, because that's the nature of why Divine Mother put me with him, because he moved in certain ways, the same way that I move, or I, in certain ways, move the same as he. I don't know how to say it. But it wasn't the defining quality, but it was important. And here's what I want to say now. I was talking to someone, a very fine devotee, who's a generation or two after me in this process, and they were presenting to me some important thoughts, and I did listen to a great deal of what they said and acted upon what they suggested. But there was also a certain, and the only word, I just have to put it in plain English, there was a certain fuzzy-mindedness to some of the thinking. It was the kind of thing that we all do, which is we're habituated to thinking in certain ways. And this is especially true when we apply our mind to the world outside. We grow up with certain prejudices, with certain political opinions, with certain ideas about how things are. Master made a point of saying at the time, and it meant something different at the time, that he was a Republican. He was not a Democrat. And what that meant at the time, because I want to make it clear, is that he didn't really believe in big government. He didn't think government intrusion into people's private lives was really that helpful. And Swamiji felt the same. Even though there is a strong feeling that if you care about people, you want the government to help. So it's very subtle. It's very complicated. And I'm not gonna even touch it right now because I know it just goes in all kinds of directions I don't want to go. But Swamiji did not accept ideas just because everybody accepted them. And Swami was not keen on letting us do it either. And he was not keen on, the only word I can think of is sloppy thinking. And he wanted us to put full energy into everything we did. And he did not want us to be guided by subconscious habit. Now, I don't mean that everybody who wants the government to solve a problem is just being guided by habit or has sloppy thinking. They may have really thought it out, and really this is the conclusion given their own point of view. They think this is the right thing. It's not important enough for me to even have an opinion. But I know with Swamiji, on many occasions, I would just say something that just like I had always said, or it always seemed true to me, or seemed like, it seemed like just that was how it was. And he was always kind. He was never sarcastic. He didn't enjoy just putting you down by any means. And his way of teaching was not to crush you. His way of teaching was to help. But he simply didn't tolerate sloppy thinking. You had to really apply your mind, is that really true? And when you just use platitudes or use convenient excuses, he would never accept it. He wouldn't attack you in the moment, but he would just keep at it. He had a tremendous respect for the power of the intellect. And then in some context, and I was just remembering this because one of the 22 points here is the intellect is also intuitive. Because I think it was the time when I was talking to him about intuition, and that I just don't have, I don't have non-rational experiences all that much. Well, in fact, I have many more than I realized because they flow rather naturally in my life. And so I don't think of them. They don't have a big, nobody plays a trumpet and a bagpipe and comes in and there's no angels carrying signs telling me what I'm supposed to do. Swami Kriyananda himself said that he's not much given to visions. He said, I mean, I don't really know where to put this, but he said the only vision he ever had once was of a big green face. He's sort of like, he doesn't really know what the big green face meant, but he saw it and there it was. But he was sort of trying to express that, well, especially on Master's path, it's not a circus. The spiritual path is not a circus. And so in that context, coming back to heart and mind, Swami said to me, and I remember him saying it to me, because I've always had a very active creative imagination, and I've always had, I don't mean that by like fantasy worlds, but whenever a situation comes up, I always think of a whole bunch of different ways that it can be solved. It's sort of it's been a little bit of a joke with me because earlier in my life, and I won't say it's true now, I didn't have that much endurance. And as a consequence of not having much endurance, I became very creative because I have no tolerance for awkward situations that aren't working out. I have a friend, and we used to actually joke about this. She has tremendous endurance, just tremendous endurance. I mean, I have so much respect for her. She can just deal with a difficult situation for a very long time. It makes her very strong. I can't. So if I'm caught in a difficult situation, I have to find a solution to it. And interestingly, she's not quite as creative as I am about solutions because her fallback is endurance. My fallback is resolution. is we've got to find another way to deal with this because I can't do this. So everything has its positive and its negative. So as a consequence, I've always had just this tremendous flow of ideas, and Swami was telling me that's when the phrase came. Well, the intellect is also intuitive. Where do ideas come from? And just because they arrive as words in the mind, or they arrive as just seemingly like a resolution to this problem. Oh, this is another way that we could do it. We could rearrange the room. We could shift the personnel. We could take this other tact. And it just has a certain common sense quality to it. Swami wanted it to be well understood that that's also intuition. And the last time I had a session, I was talking about intuition flows in the way that we flow. And because I like ideas, and I just have that kind of person, it's like as if I were a singer or a pianist, I would get piano notes and I would get ways to use my voice. But because I tend to use my mind a lot, then intuition comes to me in the form of ideas. But where do we think ideas come from? I mean, that's the interesting question. Where do ideas come from? And ideas are universal. But then they have to also match the heart. So it's not like the heart isn't part of the story just because the opening door is the concept. But then, in order to really work with that on an intuitive level, not every concept also resonates in the heart. Many ideas can be really good ideas, but they don't resonate. They don't feel right. This seems like a good idea, but it doesn't feel right. But just because things come as ideas, don't think that we have to like take the mind and turn it off. Swami never did that. In fact, I've expressed this before, but it's worth saying in this way of doing it. What Swamiji was he was perfectly balanced. He never thought just because he felt something, it didn't have to be brought to a rational level. In fact, he used his intellect very effectively as a balance point for intuition, even to the point there were on several different occasions. One of them was when we were in the middle of litigation, and Swamiji was being challenged to answer certain questions, and to answer those questions, he had to do something that Master had told him never to do, and it was a pretty tough. Master had told him to keep confidence on certain things, and yet, because of the legal situation, he was being compelled to break those confidences. So he actually took us, we were in the middle of the whole process. We took a recess, we went to a restaurant. Swamiji said, "What should I do?" And then he just sat there and let us talk. And we basically came to the conclusion that he'd proven his loyalty to Master, he'd proven his capacity to be obedient, and that there was too much at stake. He had to answer. Swami said himself, if he'd been alone, if only he would have been affected, he would have gone to prison before he would have disobeyed Master. Because that's actually where you goes. You're ordered to answer, you don't answer, you're in contempt of court, you can be sent to prison. Sometimes journalists have had to go to prison when they refuse to reveal their sources, for example. He said he would go to prison, but all of Ananda was involved, and he didn't feel that he could sacrifice all of us. So he let us talk, and we came to the conclusion that he should speak. Later, someone asked him something that hadn't occurred to me. How could you turn such a decision over to us? It was such an important decision. How could you turn it over to us? Swami's answer was interesting. Oh, he said, I never intended to let you decide. He said, I'd already made up my mind that I should answer. But I wanted to know if any of you could think of something that I hadn't thought of that would make another decision more appropriate. Now think about that. It's like he was so open. First of all, he was so open to other people's input. He wasn't really giving up decision-making himself, but he was so open to other people's input that even when so much was at stake, he was just perfectly willing to ask us. But the other part of it was, you see, he respected intelligence. He respected clear thought. he respected the idea that even though you have a feeling about what you should do, you can't be afraid to also examine that from, what should you call it, from an intellectual, from a mind point of view. Because see, we get confused because the intuitive process can be beyond reason. It doesn't mean that the more unreasonable it is, the more true it is, or that reason is the enemy of the heart. And what I realized in Swamiji was that he was just in perfect balance. He neither over-trusted nor distrusted either side of it. The mere fact that it was an intellectual idea or that he could reason it out did not mean that it was more intuitive than if he couldn't. Well, let me phrase that. That's not what I meant to say. What I meant to say is that they all work together. And we don't have to be afraid to be the kind of person that we are. We just have to ask, the kind of person that we are is simply a starting point. And we have to, each side has its weaknesses, because the feeling of the heart, unless it is tempered by calm reason, can just lead us on wild goose chases, and we just get very confused. But reason alone, when we insist that it has to be logical in the way we think is logical, without stopping, you just stop and you feel it. It's just, you feel that, and then certain ideas just have a certain resonance, and that's when the balance comes together. But don't feel, what I really wanted to say is, don't be afraid to use your mind. And sometimes I see people get frightened that if they get too clear in their minds, they're going to lose something. All I have seen is that is not true. That when you're clear in your mind, it often saves you. Because then you can, because what happens, the heart can get just as confused because it can't tell what the principle is, and it can't tell what the elements are. And it can't always go beyond platitudes. And it's also, it's just, God made us this way. I mean, in the end, we transcend all of this. I mean, heart, mind, it's just, they're just words. We move into a state that is sort of beyond all of these human realities, and we live in a very different kind of flow. So all of that seemed important to me. When I've had to work with Swamiji's books, and I put it that way, for the last 25 years, pretty much, I think, almost all the time, I'm running a book study class based on something that Swami has written. And I started it when he published The Hindu Way of Awakening, which was in the mid or late 90s. And I was reading that book. I was one of Swami's first readers, so I would read his books in manuscript form as he was going along. I mean, I was a crowd of several dozen who did that. But then I would finally have a book, and I would read the book. So I was reading Hindu Way of Awakening, and I was really struggling to understand it. And I'm quite, relatively speaking, aware of what he was writing. But I was really struggling to understand it. And I said, wow, if I'm struggling this much, I bet a lot of people are struggling. So I started a book study class on that book, and then have gone through many, many of Ananda's publications over the years. Because it takes a lot of energy to understand what Swami's saying. And one of the reasons it takes a lot of energy to understand his books is because he writes in brilliant, clear language intuitively. And what happens when at least I found, when you put out the energy to really understand what he's articulating, then an intuitive understanding comes, because that's how he's writing it. He just starts, and there's a flow of inspiration that comes right through him, but it comes through in clear, exact words. Swami knows exactly what he's trying to say, but often what he's saying, I dare say almost always, is more than just intellect. It's actual wisdom, it's actual insight. But the intellect is also one of the ways in which we can get to that insight. And so respect both halves of the equation is really all that I'm wanting to say. And realizing that the ideas that come to us as just simple ideas, or if that's how we're oriented, that's very often how Divine Mother begins to reach us. And then from whichever side we start, when we bring both sides of the coin to bear on the issue, then the possibility of being able to know and follow is greatly increased. God bless you, my friends.